Okay, it is July 9, 2016, and it is a wonderful, beautiful Sabbath. So let us ask our Heavenly Family to bless us in our discussion. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, Todah, thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful day. Thank you for the message of truth that you've given to us. Thank you for showing us even what the idea of truth is. More and more we recognize how important these things are. Please help us tonight to have a meeting according to your order. Help us to think according to the principles of genuine reason and truth. Help us to conduct real experiments and come to a true knowledge of these various subjects. Heavenly Family, fill our homes and wherever we are, our various locations, with the atmosphere of heaven. Guide us by means of the angels. Help us to unlearn whatever we need to unlearn and to learn whatever we need to learn. Todah, thank you again. We ask these things, B'Shem Tzemach. Amen. Okay, well, Rebecca, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind just even just kind of like repeating the same sort of thing in the email that you sent me. And I've been too busy. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to reply to the email, but it's just a reasonable question that you asked, and so I'm just wondering if you'd be fine with just kind of repeating that to people.
Sure. I'm going to my email so I can see what exactly I said.
Excellent.
For some reason this morning I was led to start looking into proving other things in the Word. And so I thought, well, I wonder if Jesus really was born of a virgin. And so I started searching the Internet and started looking for whatever I could regarding it, and there's some very interesting things on how some of the words may have been misinterpreted. And so I sent an email to Trent asking him what his comments would be on this topic of whether or not the birth of Christ is from a virgin. So I'm hoping that's what we really get into this evening, because I really would like to understand it more fully, since we're supposed to be proving all these things.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, here in the branch message, we need to come to the point of not being afraid of investigating anything. I mean, hey, here we are. We've already investigated the question of whether God or gods even exist. We've tackled that one. We've investigated whether Jesus really rose from the dead. These are very important things, and we had to investigate it with putting aside our preconceived ideas. We've investigated other things, whether Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And again, we had to put aside our preconceived ideas. And so there's no question that we should really be afraid to ask if we're sincerely wanting to know the truth. And, with so many things, we have had belief without knowledge. And the virgin birth, I can say, hey, I've believed it for my whole life, but I haven't had genuine knowledge concerning it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean anything one way or the other, just like Rebecca's saying. She's not saying, oh, well, there is no virgin birth or anything like that, but to say, hey, we need to investigate it in order to know. We have to conduct an experiment. And actually a variety of careful experiments. So I think that it's okay, first, it's an important topic on its own, and also it's just an excellent example for us to learn how to do these experiments. So I did briefly look at the link that you sent me. I forget the name of the guy who wrote it, but it's a blog on the internet, and it's a website. Is it Pathos or Pathos, something like that? And is the guy's name Daniel Florien or something like that? I don't remember, but he wrote this article explaining why he no longer believes in the virgin birth. And so I don't know if you wanted to go through that article to see his reasons and to see whether they're valid or not. I won't be able to pull it up right now because of internet and all of that. But if you guys wanted to pull it up and read little sections, and we can stop and comment on it and things like that, it wasn't too long. So that's one aspect, and the other aspect is looking at the question itself. But I think that article, it raises a number of the issues that are involved in the question. So it would kind of raise a number of the things that we would end up having to ask anyway. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the only thing I could do is send that link out to whoever's on the call so that they can look at it as well, I guess.
Okay, so and I'll mention that there are things in the article, and I just want to mention this from the get-go, just so that it's very clear. But I also, in one sense, I would prefer to mention this later, because then you can all understand the reasons why. But I'll state it right now, just in case there's someone who ends up not being able to be here for the whole call for whatever reason. But there are certain things within the article that are certainly not a good example of right principle. And there are other things in the article which, state things in a fair way. And there are other things which would have to be verified in terms of certain facts or claims to facts being mentioned. But the main thing that I wanted to say is one place in particular with principle that I have to strongly disagree with, and there's a quotation from a man named Thomas Paine that's in the article. Some of you may be familiar with the name because Ellen White talks about Thomas Paine and says some actually really startling things concerning him and concerning the ideas he put forth. I wanted to mention that again, just in case anyone's on for just part of this and not on for the rest. However, I will say that even though Ellen White has some very negative things to say concerning Thomas Paine, and even though I fully agree with the things that Ellen White said concerning Thomas Paine, who said something does not determine the validity or the invalidity of what is said. So when we come to the statement, we will not be looking at it based off of who said it. We will be looking at the statement itself. And that's how we have to approach things. But I know that there are certain points here which even investigating it in that light of just looking at it on its own merits and the statement on its own merits, people could stumble over that. So I wanted to just mention this from the beginning to just make that point clear. But that aside, before anyone starts reading the beginning of the article, I just wanted to find out if there are any questions that anyone has before we get into it.
If I remember correctly, I think the reason why this came up for me is because, we've been discussing who Christ was and that he was 100% human. And I think because of that, I started dwelling on, well, if he's 100% human, then how in the world can he be God as well? And I know you explained to us that it's his character that is the divine part of him. So I said, well, in that case, then his body must be of human origin. And if that's the case, okay, I'm thinking back and back and back, And so I'm thinking, okay, then he must be of the seed of the woman and the man. So how would that work? Because I never believed that in the past. I always thought it was some miraculous thing. And now I'm like, well, maybe it's not what I thought it was. Maybe I need to study this more. And I think that's where all of this started for me, questioning all of that.
Sure, yeah. I can certainly see how the one thought would lead to the other. And this is one of the aspects that certainly we need to discuss. And if you'd like, actually, we can discuss it. I have some comments in relation to it before reading this article. Would you like us to do that?
Oh, that'd be great, because I want to understand this more fully and how to, actually prove something, because I'm still trying to learn all this, and I want to understand how to do that so that I can come to the right understanding with the right principles.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, kind of the dilemma is, okay, well, how is it? We're learning that Jesus really was fully human, and we are also learning that he was fully divine, but in a different way from how we thought. We've always kind of had confused understandings of this, and people have thought, okay, well, his incarnation, he had some sort of physical divine thing that happened, so he's physically divine. But we've learned, no, actually, the composition of his body and everything was entirely human and was not divine. It was his way of thinking, his character, that was divine, and it was entirely divine. So he's 100% divine and 100% human. So it's entirely reasonable to ask, well, how could he be 100% human if he only had a mom? And it was just a miracle of sorts to, make him, even possible to be existent at all as a human. But I will say that, that kind of rests on the assumption that in order for someone to be human, that it requires a male and a female, on the female side, egg, and the male side, sperm. The fact is that is not actually required in order to make a human. That is how it is always done, or at least nearly always. Of course, if the virgin birth is true, then that's an exception. But the thing is that the egg is just means of carrying the components necessary on one hand, or some of the components necessary for making a human. The sperm is what carries the other components that are necessary for making a human. But if scientists knew enough about human biology, including human genetics, they could make a human without an egg and a sperm. They could just have the things which an egg and a sperm carry, which end up making a human. So you could actually do it, and the person would be biologically, genetically, physically, in every respect, a human, and fully a human in every respect. No non-human part of them, nothing like that. Just fully and absolutely human with no sperm and no egg. That's entirely possible. Just in terms of the physical process, it is actually possible. So that kind of cancels out the perceived dilemma in that theoretically our heavenly family could actually have something which they make or which they, whatever, however it was, something that they altered, who knows, that would have the components that a sperm would normally have, and then have that interact with Mary's egg, and thus make Jesus and him be absolutely fully human. That's entirely possible. The fact that no sperm was involved within the virgin birth model, we'll call it that for now, that does not actually cancel out the possibility of full humanity. So does that help just on that aspect? Again, that doesn't actually mean that Jesus was born of a virgin. That doesn't address the question of whether the virgin birth is true. It just addresses the perceived dilemma of whether he could be fully human if he was born of a virgin. So does that help with that?
Well, that's very interesting, and I guess I need to scientifically look into that now. So it's interesting.
Yes.
Actually, didn't the article bring out the science of that just a little bit? Now what Trent is saying even more in regards to that, that makes a lot of sense as well.
Which article are you referring to?
The one that he sent out. I had read it earlier today, and I was thinking that there was something in there talking about the science and how we'll get to it, I'm sure, if we read it or whenever we read it. But yeah, I think it said something about that it could actually be done if man was smart enough to do it. So.
Well, I read so much today that I'm not sure if it's this article or some other. Sorry, but I was reading a lot of articles today.
Yeah, well, I just read this one, so I don't know where else I would have got it. But yeah, I could be wrong, but we'll find out. But that, yeah, when you mentioned that would take away the dilemma, because even though, my mind was just going back and forth as well, because she and I have talked about this a little bit before. It's like, wow, maybe we're going to find out that Jesus did have an earthly father, and all the implications. But then, how would we know 100% for sure? So there's your dilemma. But answering it scientifically, that kind of takes away the dilemma, and it's just a very interesting subject.
Absolutely, yes, for sure. Okay, well, if there's nothing else in regard to the overall subject before getting into the article, would someone like to read the first part of the article, and then we can, pause here and there and discuss various elements?
I am not going to be able to read. We're having a thunder and lightning storm, and I have to get off my computer. So somebody that has a computer in front of them, if they can read, that would be great.
I can read it. Okay, the article title, Why I Deny the Virgin Birth of Jesus. The test read positive. Aisha's face flushed. Tears formed in her eyes. She was trapped. She would be killed. She was a stain on her family's honor. Amir, her soon-to-be husband, would turn her in as soon as he found out. She knew she deserved death. The shame was unbearable. Want to keep going?
Can you get a little bit
Sure.
closer,
Sure.
a little crisper tone?
Is better? All right. That night she had a vision. The brightness blinded her at first, but gradually she saw an angelic face, and it said, Aisha, you are favored indeed by Allah, for God himself is the father of your child. Do not be afraid. He will be great and be called the Son of the Most High. The next day, Aisha told her fiancé that God had impregnated her and she was still a virgin, and an angel had told her this. Would you believe Aisha? An ancient book says a man 2,000 years ago was born of a virgin and was sired by God himself. Once I believed this because I believed the Bible, a book I thought God himself wrote. I was wrong. Here are 5 reasons why I no longer believe in the virgin birth.
Okay, so that just, of course, is giving a little introductory example where he's trying to give the point that he's making is valid in the sense of, okay, here's a story which is pretty much the same in principle. If I tell you this story, will you believe it? And he's trying to say, well, if you won't believe this one, then why do you believe this other story? In other words, do we just believe something because of our cultural or religious biases? So that, of course, is valid. And if the story that he's giving there is not something that he just made up, but is something that people actually believe, we'd have to say, okay, well, if we test that, and then if we test the virgin birth of Jesus or the claims concerning it, and if we apply the same methods, would we end up accepting both or rejecting both or accepting one or the other? Things like that. But it's to say, hey, we need to not just go by our biases. So I'm just thinking maybe you could read one point, because he gives the 5 reasons. You could read one reason and then we can discuss it and then move on to the next, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. We're getting our dash hound out of the room because he's barking at people across the street. I apologize. Number 1, there is no reliable evidence. We have no eyewitness accounts, no doctor confirmations, no DNA samples. Ordinary events require evidence, but extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. By any classification, the virgin birth is an extraordinary event, yet there is no evidence to support it. We have no eyewitness accounts, no doctor confirmations, no DNA samples. We have nothing except a couple references in the Bible that were written many decades after the event occurred.
Okay, any comments from anyone?
Well, this is a comment having to do with the paragraphs prior to this first reason that he gave. And that shows a common misconception that either, where he says, an ancient book says a man 2,000 years ago was born of a virgin and was sired by God. So, the idea that either Jesus, which is who they're really talking about, was either sired by God or sired by a man. As you said earlier, that's not the only option. And of course, we know that in the case of Christ, he wasn't sired by God.
Yes, that is a common misconception, and I suppose it depends on what exactly he means by sired by God in that instance, but it does seem to be that, I think that he's choosing his language carefully in one sense so as not to try and make it overly literal or sexual or anything like that. But at the same time, the language implies something kind of different. And like you said, there are multiple options, multiple versions of how exactly the virgin birth took place and what it means for the virgin birth to be the virgin birth. So it's kind of difficult to overly simplify it like that. So, yeah, I think that's an excellent observation.
It's funny. It's like no doctor confirmation and no DNA. So even though back then they have, it's like 2,000 years ago. Of course they don't have all those stuff. And even though, like, do we have anything that can prove someone else 2,000 years ago? We can use DNA because it would not happen anyway. So it's just a little bit silly. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. No, I think that's another good point to bring up. And it depends on what point he's trying to make. If he's trying to say we don't have DNA evidence, therefore it's not true, then of course that's silly. I don't know if that's the point that he's trying to make. I think in this point he's just trying to say we don't have strong evidence for it. So in other words, he's not trying to say that this is evidence against it. He's mentioning this as an example of what would be good evidence that we don't have. And of course, yeah, if there was DNA evidence and, all of that sort of thing, then yeah, that would be nice. That would be good. But, of course, it's not the type of evidence that one would expect. Yeah, there are actually, DNA evidence concerning people 2,000 years ago. That does actually exist because of finding human remains and DNA and things like that. But it's for a very small percentage of people. And, what exactly do you expect to see different in the DNA? That's another question. In order for that to be part of the investigation, you have to have some sort of understanding of what you're even looking for.
I wonder if it would be a good idea to just briefly reference the whole Ron Wyatt claim about supposed DNA evidence that the blood only had one set of chromosomes instead of two.
Right. Okay, yeah, that's another evidence or supposed evidence that someone has brought forth of finding blood on the mercy seat and this and that only has one set of chromosomes. However, again, Ellen White in Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 109, says, experience which is opposed to the unchangeable principles of nature is not to be relied upon. And if someone is missing just one chromosome, they have severe challenges. I actually, to my knowledge, it's not possible for someone to live if they were missing half of their chromosomes. I don't think it's possible for a human to even develop with half chromosomes. It's just really far out there. And again, those claims have no evidence to them in terms of finding those things. But yeah, very interesting how while this person writing this article that we're looking at is saying there's no DNA evidence, interesting to note that there's at least one person who has claimed that there is, but it's only so-called evidence. It's invalid. So, yes, worth noting, however.
Well, I have a comment on that.
Ron Wyatt information had to have been a hoax, didn't it?
Well, I don't want to get into what his motives may be, and for that reason I'll refrain from the word hoax just because it may imply something concerning his motives. All I'll say is that it's entirely not valid.
Yeah, and I didn't want to get us off track either, so just go ahead and continue. I remember at the time I thought it was just awesome information, but I see now that it doesn't sound logical to me. So sorry for that interruption.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. Or was there someone else wanting to say something as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that, you can have extra chromosomes. And the reason I know that is because Down syndrome people have that extra chromosome, and it changes whatever in them. And I don't know if you know anything about Down syndrome, but they do have an extra chromosome.
Yes, Down syndrome is an excellent example to show how much of a difference it would make, but even it doesn't show it all the way because, think about it. That's actually a lot of difference. Like, it's a hugely different life, hugely different mental processes and different things like that, just because of one extra chromosome. If you're missing half of them, it's just entirely insufficient for any sort of development or life.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so either if you only had half.
Yeah, Teresa just said, she said, an egg gives half and a sperm gives half of the chromosomes, that is. So if you don't get the other half, there's no development. There's no, fertilization or anything. It's just, that's it. It's just an egg. So, yeah, it's...
Right, they pair up together, that they match up. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, okay, so we don't have that evidence. We don't have the usual stuff that's so convincing, no eyewitness accounts, no doctor confirmation, no DNA samples. So what do we have? Really, all we have, I looked, I don't see anything from Josephus about it, and, there might be other historians, but it's not likely that would have gotten into that aspect of things. But, so we have Scripture. We have accounts from people who, we believe were inspired. So I'm just wondering, is there anything else? And I know with the resurrection, what you found, were actual historical accounts that were from non-biased people, and that's awesome. But is there anything that we can ever believe? I'm just going to ask that question. Is there anything that we can ever believe that is just, for which the authority is simply people who are writing under inspiration? Because, there may be some things that we just don't have this type of information for.
I hear you. So there's actually quite a number of aspects to the things that you just said that I think are important for us to really consider. One thing is, okay, yes, we have certain types of evidence that this person, and actually just, Mary, could you just check the name of the guy who wrote the article, just so we can just reference him by name?
Yes.
Should be at the top.
Daniel Florien, Florien.
Okay, Daniel Florien. Okay, so Daniel Florien, he wrote this article and he mentioned a few things, evidence that we don't have. So we don't have doctor confirmation, we don't have DNA evidence, and we don't have eyewitness. Okay, so two of them, doctor confirmation and DNA evidence, would be highly unlikely to have no matter what. Okay, so DNA evidence, again, that is kind of, what exactly would you expect to find with DNA evidence if the idea is that Jesus was born of a virgin, but that God supplied the, what the sperm normally would supply, and that it was entirely human, then you might not actually see anything different in DNA. So it's not, in other words, to look for DNA evidence would be totally irrelevant because you shouldn't find anything different in the DNA. So it's totally irrelevant to the claim. So that's one aspect. Doctor confirmation, again, that's irrelevant to the claim too, because there's no claims of doctor involvement with the virgin birth. And really, I mean, to say virgin birth, okay, well, virgin birth, virgin conception, you have two different aspects. And in the records in Luke and in Matthew, there's no doctor involvement. The other aspect that he mentioned is eyewitness testimony. Okay, now that is a more fitting type of evidence that one might look for with this sort of event, considering the time frame and so on. So, like, for instance, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, there's actually eyewitness testimony through Josephus concerning that event. The events of the Nazarene movement in the 50s of the first century, we have eyewitness testimony concerning that through Paul. Paul also claims to give eyewitness testimony concerning the resurrection of Jesus. Not the act of resurrection, but the resurrected Jesus. So that is a more realistic expectation, or at least a realistic hope, that, okay, yes, you should have, you might have eyewitness testimony that could be part of it. Again, though, you can't always expect eyewitness testimony, and eyewitness testimony is not necessary for historical verification. In other words, you can historically verify something to be what happened in the past without eyewitness testimony. Likewise, eyewitness testimony does not confirm with certainty that something happened. At a crime scene, you can have eyewitnesses, and they can contradict each other. Well, that shows that eyewitness testimony is not actually reliable. It may be very helpful, but it's not always accurate. It's not actually a strictly reliable method to use eyewitness testimony, and that's for a number of reasons. One reason is that an eyewitness may have simply seen things wrong. Another reason is that an eyewitness could lie. Another reason is that an eyewitness, even if they don't lie, and even if they don't see things wrong, they could honestly remember things wrong when it comes to giving their testimony. Memory is a tricky thing. People don't actually remember things all that well. So eyewitness testimony, while it can be very helpful, especially if you have multiple eyewitness testimony and you can compare them, it doesn't necessarily prove anything. So again, eyewitness testimony, if it was there, how would you then determine it? And in this article, he also goes through that. He also explains how even if we had a claim by Mary herself to, conceive a child with no male involvement, basically, from his perspective, it still wouldn't be justified to believe it. But yeah, okay, so I'm not aware of any eyewitness testimony that we have, or anything that even represents eyewitness testimony. So that's just to say, yeah, we don't have evidence that would be nice to have. But again, two of those things we wouldn't expect to have. One of them we might hope to have, but we don't have. But there are also many other points in history that we don't have eyewitness testimony, but that we can determine on other grounds to be the case. So in other words, the first point doesn't really say anything one way or the other as to the validity of the virgin birth. Yeah, you're lacking certain evidences, but there could be other evidences, at least hypothetically. But the thing is, there would have to be other evidences. So if he's saying there's no evidence that we know of, in a sense, that can be a good point to say if there really is no valid evidence. But the thing is he only mentioned a few aspects, two of which you wouldn't expect, and one of which you might hope for, but it's not necessarily to be expected. So he would have to broaden his point in order to have it really strong, and then one would have to actually demonstrate that there is no evidence for it in all these different areas. So the other aspects, Carol, that you've mentioned are, okay, so we don't have these different elements, and we do have those things when it comes to the resurrection, but do we have to have that type of evidence for all things? I just wanted to say, when it comes to the resurrection, I wouldn't say that the accounts that we have are actually unbiased historical accounts necessarily. Maybe to some extent, but also, I mean, you know, we primarily looked at things from the writings of Paul. We didn't even really look at the accounts in the Gospels. We just looked at primarily what Paul had to say on the question. And Paul believed in the resurrection. So you could say that that's a bias. So it's not necessarily about whether your accounts are biased or not. It's about what can you determine from your accounts that you can demonstrate to be true regardless of bias. So that's an important point. Then there's a couple other aspects that you mentioned. You said something about Josephus and the virgin birth. I don't know if Josephus actually ever did say anything about the virgin birth. I know that there's a passage in the writings of Josephus that speaks very highly of Jesus, but the vast majority, if not all historians, believe that that text in its current form has been manipulated by the hands of a Christian scribe, which basically has Josephus confessing Jesus to be the Messiah and all of that, which, again, considering what we know about Josephus from his own autobiography and things like that, it doesn't look like he ever became a believer in the Messiah, to my knowledge. I mean, that would have to be demonstrated, but we know for sure that Christian scribes have manipulated things throughout the centuries. So if it confesses the virgin birth, we just have to keep in mind that that might be an edit by a Christian scribe. The other aspect that you mentioned, Carol, is, okay, what we have is just Scripture. Let's specify this a little bit more, because what we really have, as far as accounts of the virgin birth, are an account in Luke and an account in Matthew. Those are the two references in the New Testament to the virgin birth of Jesus. The only other one that someone might use is Revelation 12, but the woman there is not actually Mary, and it's not actually an account of the virgin birth of Jesus. It's a prophetic description using symbols and this and that and the dragon. It's not really an account of the virgin birth or anything like that. There's two accounts of the virgin birth in the New Testament. One is in Luke, one is in Matthew. So what we have to ask is, in connection with what Carol has mentioned, okay, do these accounts, do we believe them to be a product of inspiration? Well, we have to question that. Do we believe it? The next question is, do we know whether those accounts are products of inspiration? Do we have genuine knowledge? Have we done experiments to find out whether those accounts are a product of inspiration? Do those accounts claim to be a product of inspiration? Does either Luke or Matthew claim inspiration at all? These are accounts that have to be, or these are questions that have to be seriously considered in regard to a question like this, because the other aspect that Carol mentioned of is it ever okay to believe something just because we're told through inspiration without having the sort of evidence that we might have otherwise? Now, here's the thing. If neither Matthew nor Luke claim inspiration, then that other aspect is not relevant to the conversation. In other words, if neither of them claim inspiration, and if neither of them are inspired, then the question of whether it is okay to believe something because of being told by inspiration, even without having the other sorts of evidence, that question would not relate to this subject. However, I do think it's a very important question, and I think it's worth replying to, and I'll comment on it a little bit right now. Okay, so we can believe something just by being told from an inspired source. However, that belief may not be founded. In other words, someone can believe just because of that reason. But that doesn't mean that it's a belief with knowledge. Knowledge can only come about as a result of experimentation. That's the only way to receive knowledge. And that's gone through in the Silver Trumpet Volume 1, Number 9, and also in the recent videos that we uploaded called Understanding Knowledge. The other aspect to this is that knowledge is not just gained through direct experimentation. It can be gained through indirect experimentation, and sometimes indirect experimentation is actually the only way to receive knowledge and the better way to receive knowledge. So, you could say, okay, well, what about knowing, let's say someone makes a claim. If you drink this liquid, you will die. Let's say someone makes that claim. Well, you know what? In that circumstance, it's way better to gain indirect knowledge rather than direct knowledge. And if it's an instant death, then you cannot gain direct knowledge because you would die the moment you drink it and wouldn't actually have learned anything. You wouldn't actually know because you would be dead. So in that circumstance, indirect knowledge is the better and only way in multiple respects. We can know things based off of inspiration without having a direct historical connection. So, for instance, the things that Ellen White talks about, that she saw in vision concerning the fall of Satan or the fall of Lucifer before the creation of this world. Well, you know what? To my knowledge, and who knows, maybe I'm wrong on this. Maybe I just don't know. But I'll say that I'm totally unaware of historical evidence for those events. I'm totally unaware of different things that we could use to employ a regular historical method to determine what really happened. Hypothetically, it's possible. Just because something took place somewhere other than on this planet does not mean it's beyond the reach of historical investigation. So there may actually be ways to determine historically what happened. But I'm unaware of anything. And to my knowledge, maybe there's no way to determine historically what happened before the fall of man, when Lucifer fell. Does that mean, though, that we cannot know? The answer to that is no. We can know, but only through indirect experimentation. So we can do direct experiments, or more direct experiments at least, in order to determine whether or not Ellen White was inspired by our Heavenly Family. We can and we have demonstrated that our Heavenly Family really exists, and that they spoke through Ellen White, that they gave her a vision. This is in our investigation of Revelation chapter 10, which includes the revelation of the seven thunders, or at least it includes the reference to the revelation of the seven thunders. And we can determine by historical methodology that is what happened, that our Heavenly Family really exists, just like we can determine that Paul existed, just like we can determine that Jesus existed, and just like we can determine that Jesus exists and that he rose from the dead. These things we can and have historically demonstrated. That's very, very important. We can actually demonstrate that our Heavenly Family spoke through Ellen White and that she was appointed as their messenger. We can demonstrate the validity and the importance of all of the principles that Ellen White communicated in the counsel that she gave. You can also demonstrate the reliability of her visions. Now that's all very important, because that shows you that this is an example of trust. This is genuine faith. Like we've talked about before, like an astronaut going to space, and guess what? He's not a spacecraft engineer. But he has determined that the spacecraft engineers who put together, designed, and all of that, the spacecraft which he is boarding, he has determined by experimental knowledge that they are reliable. And thus he knows indirectly, again, it would actually be impossible for him to have a direct knowledge of everything that they know in order to determine the safety of the spacecraft. It would be impossible because he would have to go through the education that they had. He would have to, really learn so much more than it would be possible for him to learn within the limited life that he has, and learn all the things necessary to be an astronaut and to do the experiments in space that he has to do and all of those things. Within the limited time, he only can do so much. But he can determine through experiment that they are reliable, and that he can thus depend on their experience and thus know. Okay, so that's an example, and no one would think that that's unreasonable. No one would think, oh, well, he can't really know, and oh, he shouldn't get into the spaceship because it's only knowledge gained through indirect experiment. No.
They must have got bumped off.
We must have lost them.
I don't see that they left a call yet, but, sometimes that happens like a minute later.
Yeah, they'll be back.
They'll show up.
Well, in the bottom of that article, there are some other comments that people have done some other studies in regards to some of the words and everything. So those were also interesting to read. But I'm really fascinated what Trent is sharing with us.
I had something I'd read also in, I've got this book called The Lost Books of the Bible, and it's like New Testament books. And there's this one called The Proto-Evangelion, and it's kind of about Mary's birth, and it's interesting, and Mary's just all about Mary. And there's this one chapter that talks about Joseph and Mary's chastity proved. And it's super interesting. I don't know if we can talk about that, but
that is interesting.
Have you read that? I know you have, because I couldn't pronounce the name of that book before. But anyway, go ahead. I mean, I have the page right here. I could. It's just a couple paragraphs, but it's really interesting. Where who knows if this is inspired or if this is authentic or anything. I have not tested it on that. It's a very interesting read, though.
I would be curious to know what it said if it's really short. If anyone else would like to hear it too.
Since you're there, I think it would be good for you to read it. But I just want to briefly finish the thought before our call dropped, just so that I don't end up kind of forgetting it and that sort of thing. So the point that I was making is just how, just like an astronaut can have indirect experimental knowledge, and that is entirely genuine and valid concerning the safety of his spacecraft due to the experience of the engineers involved in making the spacecraft, just so we can actually have genuine experimental knowledge concerning things in the past gained through inspiration. So let's say a vision that our Heavenly Family gives concerning something before the creation of this world even though we might not be able to historically investigate that at the present time, we can actually know if we've done the experiments to determine the validity and the reliability of the source. So, in other words, in answer to that question, Carol, the answer is yes. But it's not an exception to experimental knowledge. It's just experimental knowledge applied in a different way, as experimental knowledge must be applied in different ways for every circumstance. So I hope that helps. But yeah, Mary, if you would like to read it, I think that everyone would find it fascinating.
It's fascinating. The book is called The Proto-Evangelion. I probably didn't say that right, but chapter 10, just real quick overview. They have a little overview here. It says, Joseph returns from building houses, finds the virgin grown big, being 6 months gone with child, is jealous and troubled, reproaches her, she affirms her innocence, he leaves her, determines to dismiss her privately, is warned in a dream that Mary is with child by the Holy Ghost, and glorifies God who hath shown him such favor. And then so that's chapter 10, and then chapter 11 is where they're kind of in trouble now. They're in trouble. Mary says, this is in chapter 10. I'll just read a couple paragraphs from chapter 10. Let me see. Just after, this is verse 7, just after the same manner it has happened to me. Then Joseph, arising from the ground, called her and said, O thou who hast been much favored by God, why hast thou done this? Why hast thou debased thy soul, who is educated in the Holy of Holies, and received thy food from the hand of angels? But she, with a flood of tears, replied, I am innocent. I have known no man. Then said Joseph, how come it to pass that you are with child? Mary answered, as the Lord my God liveth, I know not by what means. Then Joseph was exceedingly afraid and went away from her, considering what he should do with her. And he thus reasoned with himself, if I conceal her crime, I shall be found guilty by the law of the Lord. And if I discover her to the children of Israel, I fear lest she, being with child by an angel, I shall be found to betray the life of an innocent person. What therefore shall I do? I will privately dismiss her. Then the night was come upon him, when behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, and said, be not afraid, take that young woman, for that which is within her is of the Holy Ghost, and she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Then Joseph arose from his sleep, glorified the God of Israel, who had shown him such favor and preserved the virgin. Okay, so now he's got the dream, just like whatever Matthew says. And then chapter 11. Then Aeneas, the scribe, said to Joseph, whenceforth have we not seen you since your return? Because Joseph was away building houses, and that's when Mary got pregnant. And she, by the sounds of it, she knew this was going to happen, but didn't really understand it. And then she just started getting bigger. It seems like she didn't even know of the conception experience. Like she just was getting bigger and bigger and didn't really understand it. Then verse 2 says, and Joseph replied, because I was weary after my journey and rested the first day. But Aeneas turning about, perceived the virgin big with child, and went away to the priest and told him, Joseph, in whom you place so much confidence, is guilty of a notorious crime, in that he has defiled the virgin whom he received out of the temple of the Lord, and hath privately married her, not discovering it to the children of Israel. Then said the priest, hath Joseph done this? Aeneas replied, if you send any of your servants, you will find that she is with child. And when the servants went and found it, as he said. Upon this, both she and Joseph were brought to their trial, and the priest said to her, Mary, what hast thou done? Why hast thou debased thy soul and forgot thy God, seeing thou was brought up in the Holy of Holies, and didst receive thy food from the hands of angels, and heardest their songs? Why have you done this? To which, with a flood of tears, she answered, as the Lord my God liveth, I am innocent in his sight, seeing I know no man. Then the priest said to Joseph, why have you done this? And Joseph answered, as the Lord my God liveth, I have not been concerned with her. But the priest said, lie not, but declare the truth. Thou hast privately married her, and not discovered it to the children of Israel, and humbled thyself under the mighty hand of God, that thy seed might be blessed. And Joseph was silent. Then said the priest to Joseph, you must restore to the temple of the Lord the virgin which you took thence. But he wept bitterly. And the priest added, I will cause you both to drink the water of the Lord, which is for trial, and so your iniquity shall be laid open before you. Then the priest took the water and made Joseph drink, and sent him to a mountainous place. And he returned perfectly well. And all the people wondered that his guilt was not discovered. So the priest said, since the Lord hath not made your sins evident, neither do I condemn you. So he sent them away. Then Joseph took Mary and went to his house, rejoicing and praising the God of Israel. So obviously they had some kind of drink poison, and if you live, you're not lying, and if you die, well, you lied. Some kind of test of that sort. But
yeah, that's interesting. That's not the part that I thought you were going to read, actually. There's another part closer to the end,
okay,
where there's a test that I think if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a little while since I've read this, but it was either Salome, Jesus' sister, or it was the maid of someone at the quote-unquote inn, or I think in this one it's a cave, someone there who actually did a physical experiment in the sense of a physical examination of Mary after the fact to see if she was still a virgin. And the way that, do you remember that now?
Was it in the Gospel of the Birth of Mary or the
No, it's in the Proto-Evangelium of James, or the Proto-Evangelium. There's two ways that I've seen it spelled, either the Proto-Evangelium or the Proto-Evangelium.
Let's see.
It's okay, though. You don't have to read it. It might be better for people to read this part on their own anyways, seeing as it's a bit more graphic and everything.
Okay.
But it's, interesting. This is an interesting account. It claims to be written by James. I don't know if it really is written by James. I'll just say, if there was anything like this written by James, what we're reading here is different from what he wrote. And the reason why I say that is because there are historians currently tracing the development of this text and are finding, there was recently found an earlier version of this called the Genesis of Mary. And it's the same document, but it's an earlier version of it, and it has some big differences. So the later versions of it promote the perpetual virginity of Mary, whereas the early version does not have anything at all like that. And I don't have the earlier version available to me. I don't know if there are any English translations of it. It's you can buy a Greek copy of it, but it's like almost $1,000 or something like that, and it's a facsimile of the manuscript. There was a talk given by a guy who is working on it, and he was explaining the differences from the earlier edition to the later editions. But it's an interesting text either way. I will say, though, that there are some elements in it that make one wonder. Like, it portrays Mary as coming from a priestly family, and is in some sense attempting to justify the priesthood of Christ by means of that. But I think on a historical basis, it would be pretty odd for it to actually be true that Jesus was of a priestly family, because, for instance, whoever wrote Hebrews, if Jesus really was of a priestly family, the author of Hebrews would promote that, because he's all talking about Jesus as priest, and so he would promote that. But instead, he acknowledges that Jesus was not of a priestly family, which would be against his purposes, because it's an extra stumbling block for people reading his letter. And so it seems like it would be, if it's true, it'd be really weird for the author of Hebrews to deny it. Then there are some other elements in there that seem very fantastic, like the infant Jesus talking, for one thing, and the things that the infant Jesus says. And like just literally like right after being born, the infant Jesus is talking in this text. And, and even things like this verification here. Again, this verification, if you were there and it actually happened and it was live, that would be one thing. But reading this account of it doesn't necessarily give that same evidence. It's more like, for us at this point at least, it's just an anecdotal story. There are other texts. There's a text known as the Acts of Pilate, and it describes Jesus, his trial before Pilate. He's there, and he goes into this kind of judgment hall, and Pilate's there, and you have all these guards standing, and they're holding these banners. Like, they have a big pole that has this kind of flag, this Roman flag, with a picture of Caesar on it. And as Jesus comes in, all the flags drop down to the ground, and the soldiers are holding them, and they bend over, and so they're all bowing down to Jesus. And Pilate says to him, like, hey, whoa, what are you guys doing? Like, here we have this guy bringing him before trial, and here you are all bowing down to him. And they say, it wasn't us. There's nothing that we can do about it. The flags just dropped. We can't help it. It's just automatic that these flags, that Caesar on these flags is bowing down to Jesus. And so Pilate's like, okay, well, we got to put an end to this foolishness. So they get, I think it was 6 soldiers holding each pole. So they have 6 soldiers holding each pole, and they take Jesus out and everything, and they get the soldiers in, and then Jesus walks in, and then again, even with all the 6 soldiers, it just drops down, and, no one can deny, Caesar is worshiping Jesus, that sort of idea. That is, again, a legendary account that doesn't have any historical legitimacy to it, but it's the sort of thing that Christians wrote after a couple centuries. And these are different things that are supposed to be evidencing the legitimacy of Jesus. Again, when it comes to the Proto-Evangelium of James, I am very, very interested to read the early version, known as the Genesis of Mary. When it becomes available, I think it's going to be very important to investigate, to see what the differences are as compared to the later versions, and to see, does this have legitimate historical information? One of the things about this writing is that it's very Jewish. And just the fact of it being very Jewish at least has it more in the realm of potential for historical accuracy, because, hey, let's face it, Jesus was Jewish. That was the context. once you have a text which is portraying Jesus as non-Jewish and all of that, well, you're totally exiting the realm of historicity. So I think we should keep our eyes open for that, and these are important texts for us to investigate.
I found that place where the midwife, Joseph basically tells her, hey, Mary's going to have a baby. She's a virgin. I've not been with her. And the midwife basically exclaims, the midwife said to her, Salome, Salome, I will tell you a most surprising thing which I saw. A virgin hath brought forth, which is a thing contrary to nature, to which Salome replied, as the Lord my God liveth, unless I receive particular proof of this matter, I will not believe that a virgin has brought forth. Then Salome went in, and the midwife said, Mary, show thyself, for a great controversy is risen concerning thee. And Salome received satisfaction. But her hand was withered, and she groaned bitterly, and said, Woe to me, because of my iniquity, for I have tempted the living God, and my hand is ready to drop off. Then Salome made her supplication to the Lord, and said, O God of my fathers, remember me, for I am of the seed of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Make me not reproach among the children of Israel, but restore to me sound to my parents. But anyway.
Okay,
kind
so
of like
either that
kind of thing where she was like, I'm not going to believe it unless I see it, which is, kind of what we're doing too.
To some extent, depending on what we mean by see, because we can have indirect experiment. But I have to say either that translation was watered down or you skipped a part.
It's not. I'm looking through it. I've been reading it as you've been talking, and I can't see, and I don't remember it like that. I think I would remember that. Like I remember the story I probably read this 6 months ago. I remember the story as we brought the topic up, and I don't remember what you said. So yeah, it's definitely a G-rated version of it.
Yeah, definitely. There's another translation by Bart Ehrman where I think it's a little bit more realistic, but he has a sense of humor too. So the way that he translates it is very blunt. So it has Salome saying, brace yourself, which is, one accurate way. It is accurate. It's not inaccurate, but it's a way to translate what this text says. Brace yourself, and then it says that she inserted her finger into Mary, and then her hand withered. So it's like she had some sort of problem with her hand, and then she prays for a miracle to have her hand healed, and that sort of thing. So that's what the text says. But yeah, it's an interesting text, and yes, it is a text. If we are not going to stay within the borders of the canon, which of course we shouldn't stay within the borders, then that is one of the texts which has to be on the table when discussing the virgin birth. But again, we have to question, okay, well, how much does this tell us in terms of the history of what actually happened? But we have to do the same thing with the other Gospels. So again, it's just really in Luke and in Matthew, and comparing the accounts, I think, is important. Also seeing the claims of the accounts. But there's a whole lot to this. Would you like to read the second point in the article, Mary?
Sure. Yes. The earliest references are late and sparse is number 2. And the text is, why is such an important story left out of all the early sources? Probably because it hadn't been made up yet. Paul, the earliest New Testament author, never mentions the virgin birth. For someone who we rely upon for much of Christian theology, it is an odd omission. Paul refers to Jesus' birth twice, Romans 1:3 and Galatians 4:4, and never says he was born of a virgin or of different means than anyone else. You'd think that would be important. The virgin birth is also not in Mark, the earliest gospel, or in John, the only other gospel not based on Mark. Why is such an important story left out of all the early sources? Probably because it hadn't been made up yet. Why wouldn't the story be made up? Perhaps to fulfill an old prophecy of a virgin birth, which the Gospel of Matthew cites, Isaiah 7:14, Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Some scholars say virgin was a mistranslation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the gospel writers used, and should have been translated young woman. That means the story might have been based on a mistranslation. It seems likely the virgin birth was created to boost the authority of Christianity through prophecy and compete with rival gods who were born of virgins.
Okay, so there's actually a number of elements there. First, he addresses the fact that there is, it's really just in Luke and in Matthew that we find any discussion of the virgin birth within the New Testament. Paul doesn't reference it, even though he does reference the birth of Jesus. And it's kind of like, okay, well, what's up with that? John doesn't reference it. It's just those two places. One of the things, though, that I would say is that, he emphasizes a couple times there how it's not in any of the early sources. All of the early sources do not include reference to this. Well, of course, that's just excluding Luke and Matthew, because in a sense they are early sources. Most scholars think that they're earlier than John. So in a sense you could consider them early sources, yet still they're, at least 60 or 70 years probably after the event, or the claimed event at least. So still, that is quite a while after, and one could wonder, well, okay, why wouldn't it be in Mark? Why wouldn't it be in John? And why wouldn't it be in Paul's letters? Now, I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, it is kind of interesting that there's not more written on it, being that, it's coming across as though it's so miraculous. I mean, to me, that would be something you would write about unless, this happened all the time. And then it's like it's no big deal to people. I don't know. Those are just thoughts that come to me.
Okay. Well, I think we can know that it's not the type of thing that just happened all the time. This is one of the things, too, that he references about other virgin births in the ancient world. I'm not familiar with that. I've heard that sort of thing before, and I don't know if you guys have ever watched the documentary Zeitgeist, but it starts out with trying to debunk Jesus sort of thing, like, oh, Jesus isn't really real and stuff like that. And it cites all these examples of how Jesus is so much like all these other gods, like, oh, he's just like a resurrected god of Egypt, and he's just like, like Osiris. He was resurrected after 3 days, just like Jesus was. He had 12 primary followers, just like Jesus did, and, all these different things. But the fact is, none of those things are actually valid. Like, there is no resurrected god of Egypt or of any other ancient nation. There's no resurrected god. I mean, Osiris didn't actually resurrect. He just became the ruler of the underworld. He died and went into the underworld and became the ruler there. That's really, really different from resurrecting. He didn't have these 12 apostles or anything like that. Like, there's things that at some point were just made up that are supposed to be parallels between Jesus and other ancient gods or ancient figures. And a lot of them are not actually valid. A lot of them are truly just made up. Not to say that there aren't any. Like this whole virgin birth thing, I don't know. But it would have been helpful if the person who wrote this article would have cited things so that people could actually go check it out. Because, I'm not familiar with any virgin birth stories from other nations. There are definitely stories of gods coming down and having sex with human women and producing offspring. Those stories are definitely there. but I'm not familiar with other virgin birth stories. Maybe someone else here is, and if so, you could mention it. And again, with me saying that, it's not to say that there aren't any. I'm just unfamiliar with it.
On the topic of, why these earlier New Testament accounts don't mention it, I'm not sure that, these people either walked with Jesus or knew of Jesus. They're talking about his life, not his birth, and I don't know that it's normal. Maybe some of his family members might be more inclined to talk about that, but, they're talking about the later part of his life, and I'm not sure that you would naturally bring up his birth and how that happened. I don't know that, that wasn't something that affected them. That's not something that they lived and saw. They probably, in most cases, didn't even know of him at that stage, or, some of them weren't even born yet.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's just take the Gospel of Mark. Well, the Gospel of Mark doesn't actually say anything about his childhood or his adolescence or anything like that, but that in no way means that he didn't have a childhood and adolescence. Obviously he had a childhood and adolescence, and he had a birth, but Mark just didn't address that one way or the other. And again, someone might say, okay, well, maybe that wasn't his purpose, his interest. That could be, and, I could definitely, someone could raise the objection that, but if it's a virgin birth, that's pretty significant. But I could see how someone might still, even if they know about the virgin birth, even if they believe in the virgin birth, still might not mention it, just because they don't want to start off with something that might turn off certain people. Perhaps it would be something that people would object to right away, and if Mark wants to start more subtly or more, even though he does start with a bold claim, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, that's starting with a very bold claim, but it's not starting with something that could sound like a make-believe story. So, again, I'm just saying, who knows? And this would have to be examined more to see, okay, would Mark actually want to include it? Because maybe you could determine that he really would if it was true and if he knew about it. But at least for now, we can conceive of a circumstance in which the virgin birth could be true, but yet Mark not include it. And John, well, it depends. Like, let's say John came after Matthew and Luke, and he's wanting to address different things. Let's just say, there's already been a lot written about Jesus, and I want to address the things that haven't really been addressed yet. You can definitely conceive of that. With Paul, you could say that's a little bit trickier because he actually does talk about the birth of Jesus. But he doesn't talk about Jesus being born of a virgin. But I don't think he mentions Jesus' father either. So you could say, okay, well, you could kind of go both ways with that. He omitted reference to the virgin birth, but he also omitted reference to Jesus having a father or Joseph being his father or anything like that. So that's kind of interesting. The other aspect is that we don't have all of Paul's letters. So it's hard to say what, obviously you wouldn't be able to say, that's because it was in his other letter that we don't have. No, that would be going too far. That would be stating what we don't know because we don't have it. But it also shows that it's difficult to make statements about what Paul doesn't say. You can't really say what Paul doesn't say or didn't say because we don't have everything that he said. Even if we had all of his letters, we don't have everything that he spoke to individuals or to groups. But knowing that we don't have all of his letters, because again, even within his own letters, he refers to other letters. There's the letter to the Laodiceans that he refers to. There's another letter to the Corinthians before 1 Corinthians that is referenced within 1 Corinthians. There's things like that. And so we don't have all of his letters. We can't really make meaningful statements about what he didn't write about. So that's kind of neither here nor there.
Well, another aspect of the whole thing would be that the family, especially Jesus' mother, Jesus himself, would want to conceal the fact that he was born in this way just for his safety till he can complete his mission. So, I wonder how many people, because of the fact that the family's trying to conceal that fact, maybe people weren't all that aware of it.
That's an interesting point as well, as to how, hey, if it's true, it's probably not something that would be publicized a lot. Like, it's not something that they would walk around really bragging about or anything like that. It would probably be something that they would, keep hush-hush, so to speak. But again, what we're doing so far is we are considering the reasons that are given in this article and seeing how, again, so far the reasons have not really been that great in terms of why the virgin birth isn't true. But we actually haven't yet given any reasons as to why it is. So those are two different questions. One is, are the arguments that this individual gives valid arguments? The second is, did the virgin birth really happen? Two separate questions. Of course, they relate. And we won't be able to discuss this in its fullness tonight. It's already getting, a little bit late. We've been on for just over an hour and a half. There is another element that that this article mentioned within this point that I'd like to comment upon. It mentions about, how could this have come about? And, well, could just be because of a mistranslation of Isaiah's prophecy and then the gospel writers using that. Now, to be clear, this is not saying a mistranslation of what the Gospels say. It's indisputable that Luke and Matthew claim that Jesus was born of a virgin. Luke and Matthew both make that claim explicitly, very, very clearly. So what this guy is talking about is, Daniel Florien, I think is what he is saying is that some scholars say that Isaiah's prophecy in the Septuagint was mistranslated. I'd go further with that. I don't think that any scholar denies that, in the sense that the word in Hebrew, whether you're looking at the Masoretic text or the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, when it says, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child and all that, the word there that we typically read as virgin, in Hebrew, is just a word for young woman or maiden. That's it. It's not a word for a virgin. The Greek Septuagint, the word that it uses is virgin. And the Greek Septuagint came before the writing of those Gospels. So Matthew quotes Isaiah 7:14 as a prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus. And it's going off of the Greek. And, I don't know of anything that would suggest that was actually originally in the Hebrew. Because, again, all of our Hebrew manuscripts including the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are very ancient manuscripts, just say young woman. They don't say virgin. So, I don't know if anyone could really make a sound argument that in Hebrew it was originally virgin.
Trent?
Yes?
Well, I've always understood the word maiden to mean virgin.
The word maiden can be used to refer to a virgin, but the word in Hebrew, it's alma, and it does not mean virgin. It just means a young woman.
Right. I think that was their understanding, though, a young woman, maiden. Anyway, that's the way I've always understood their understanding was that a young woman, maiden, was also a virgin. I just thought I'd mention that because that's what I've always thought.
Okay, well, it's not the case that the Hebrew word, alma, means or implies virginity at all. It just means a young woman. So that's...
The way the translators translated it does represent their interpretation, but they had to ignore the fact that that's not what the word actually means. They just superimposed their understanding on it and translated it to reflect their theology.
Yeah, but there's many other places where the word alma shows up throughout, quote-unquote, the Hebrew Bible, and it's not translated virgin, and it doesn't refer to virgins. It doesn't refer to women who have not had sexual intercourse. It just refers to a woman who's young who may have had sexual intercourse. In Hebrew and in Judaism, in ancient Judaism and everything, it wasn't automatically assumed that because a woman is young that she hasn't had sex. Just like today, we don't automatically assume that because a woman is young, she hasn't had sex. Perhaps you could say that, hey, maybe the majority of young women are also virgins. But still, being a young woman and being a virgin are two different things. That said, there are times when the word alma can be used within a setting where it's talking about virgins, but the word doesn't inherently imply that. So, they can be used in a way that it's referring to women who are young and who are virgins, and it can even be used parallel to virgins, but the word itself does not mean that. It's important to understand that. Now, one possibility is that the Septuagint was translating from a Hebrew manuscript that actually said virgin. But again, I don't know if anyone could make a sound case for that, because the copies of the Septuagint that we have for Isaiah are after the time of Christ. And the earliest Hebrew manuscripts that we have of Isaiah are before that. And we have multiple copies of Isaiah in Hebrew that differ from one another. And still, the unanimous testimony of all the Hebrew manuscripts is young woman, not virgin. So, yeah, it seems to be the case with all the evidence that we presently have that the original reading of Isaiah 7:14 was not virgin, but was alma. Now, that said, again, Matthew is definitely using it to say virgin. And Matthew is definitely promoting the virgin birth. Luke also is definitely promoting a virgin birth. The question is more complex than that, by the way. Luke, as we have it, is definitely promoting the virgin birth. The reason why I say Luke as we have it is because many scholars believe that the first two chapters of Luke were not originally part of Luke, but that they were later added to Luke. And there's a number of reasons why that may be the case. One is that chapter 3 of Luke sounds like the beginning of a book. in the year of such and such a person, this and this and this and this, and John the Baptist, and then, it goes on to describe Jesus beginning his ministry, and then it gives a genealogy of Jesus. Well, if Luke chapter 3 was the beginning of Luke, then it makes sense to give his genealogy where it is. But it really is awkward that Luke's genealogy is where it is in Luke as it presently is. It would make more sense to have the genealogy of Jesus when you're describing his birth. It's kind of awkward to describe Jesus' birth and his youth, and then say, in such and such a year, it sounds like the beginning of the book, and then you describe John the Baptist, and then you get back to Jesus, you just introduce Jesus, and then you give his genealogy. It's just kind of weird. It's kind of a weird place to put it. And there are other reasons why scholars believe that the first 2 chapters of Luke were later additions rather than originally being part of Luke. That would have to be looked into more by each individual and everything, but it's relevant to this topic, and so it's only right for me to mention it. So there are other factors. There are other things that Daniel Florien mentions in his article that need to be discussed in relation to this question. And then we also just have to deal with the question on its own. Even if none of the things brought out by Daniel Florien in his article are valid reasons for believing that Jesus was not born of a virgin, we still have to gain an experimental knowledge of whether or not he was, aside from the article. But I think this helps us to discuss it. So anyways, we've been on for quite some time now. We should start to draw the meeting to a close. Does anyone have any last comments or questions?
A point came up, Trent, that you said you didn't know of any other gods or pagan gods that were born of virgin. And I kind of just looked it up, and there actually is quite a few. Horus was the legend of Horus is an ancient myth. In Egypt,
hey, Anna.
was born. Yeah.
I just want to ask you first. What is the source that you're reading from?
There's actually there's a few of them, so I just took one of them. So, but I haven't looked into it. I just Googled it to see if there was any sense of other so-called pagan gods that were claiming to be born of a virgin. So.
Right. So the reason why I ask is because I'm aware that there are many claims that, many modern people who claim that there were ancient virgin births for gods and stuff like that. I know that there's people today who say that that's the case, but I don't know of any ancient sources that describe that. So, for instance, many people today say that there's a theme in the ancient world of a resurrected God, and that's the basis for the resurrection of Jesus and things like that. But the fact is that there's no ancient source which verifies the idea that ancient people had an idea of a resurrected God. In fact, there's no example in ancient sources of a resurrected God. So that's the question. The question when it comes to whether there are ancient examples of virgin births of gods, we have to go by ancient sources. Yes, some modern people claim that, in the ancient world there's all these gods that had virgin births. But that's just a claim until people can show from ancient sources that there were virgin births of gods in ancient belief.
Okay, yeah. So that I think I'm reading some modern sources, but no ancient.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's why I just wanted to check, because that's what is necessary to substantiate that one way or the other. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to this at some point. We'll have to pray about exactly when. We may continue on with this next Friday night, or maybe we'll be continuing with the community rule. Who knows exactly where Heavenly Family will lead. But rest assured we will discuss it, and who knows, maybe we'll even end up discussing it tomorrow night to whatever extent. So guide us with that, Heavenly Family. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family as a closing to the meeting?
I will.
Wonderful.
Heavenly Family, I thank you for the truth. I thank you for guiding us into all truth. I thank you for Rebecca's question and for giving us the tools that we need to gain true knowledge, experimental knowledge, and to test this claim in the way that you want us to, Heavenly Family. I thank you for these tools. I thank you for the guidance of the Spirit of Prophecy through Trent. And I pray that you bless us all, as I'm sure we're all very curious as to where this is going to lead, and help us to just take away our preconceived ideas and just really come to you honestly and openly, just looking for the truth. And be with us all. Put your hand of blessing upon us. Send your angels to minister to us, Heavenly Family. We love you so much, and we ask this in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
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 All right. Well, love you all very much. Have a good sleep, and look forward to seeing you guys all on the call tomorrow.
Have a good night, guys. Good night.
Good night.
Lila Tov.